Well, good morning. I'm excited to be here. I am a huge fan of Humanity Plus. I'm a huge fan of this organization. I am absolutely committed to the vision that animates this organization because I believe that the idea of combining information technology with human biology is the biggest opportunity of our lifetimes. I'm certain of that. If you look at all the productivity gains the last 40 years, they've been driven by information technologies. But in many respects, our medical institutions and many of the other aspects of how we handle our own human biology haven't really caught up with that. And now finally the technology is starting to merge. And I think that's a tremendous opportunity. I see it as bigger than clean tech. I see it bigger than space exploration and some of these other really futuristic and exciting opportunities that lie ahead. I think it's a gigantic opportunity. And of course, it will touch every single one of our lives. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to address H+ again. I had good fun last spring when I was able to address the group at Harvard University. And at that time, I got acquainted with the organization, learned much more about it, and I'm just so excited to be back here today. Oh, thanks. Oh, how about that? I have no idea what to do here. Is it? Oh, okay, thanks. Wow. I know it's sort of ironic that at a high-tech conference that we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. Isn't that always the case? Oh, so the cable came out. It's the simplest thing in the world. Yeah. Thank you, Amy, for saving me here. That's right. Good. So we've got power. We've got a computer. Apparently, we're getting sound. That's great. So the topic I want to address today is information transformation, and I actually thought that might be a useful way to kind of frame up today's all of the events of today and tomorrow. So humanity is about to go through this tremendous change. The focus for this morning is about media and media technologies, and there's been a tremendous innovation there. But the connection to the Humanity Plus topics and human biology might not be as clear, so I'm going to try to explore that a little bit today. Now, I would assert to you that we live in this era of BS, tremendous amounts of BS. There's a lot of misinformation out there right now. In fact, the term I would say BS stands for is before singularity. In the sense that there's this tremendous sense of anticipation. The term has been popularized. Obviously, Ray Kurzweil has done a brilliant job of getting the phrase out there. But there's all sorts of different interpretations. When a message like that is filtered through pop media, you end up with images like this. And so this is a little bit what I talked about at Harvard last spring, is that this is the popular idea of what transhumanism is going to be. That somehow there's this time before the singularity where we all look the way we look right now, and then after the singularity, this magic moment where we look like this, where we're transformed into these hideously ugly monsters with like gears sticking out of our heads and cables and human-animal hybrids and so forth. That's kind of a scary thing, right? That's kind of a scary image. And if you look at the way transhumanism is portrayed in pop media, it's almost always a scary image, right? It's the Terminator. It's the Wolverine, that kind of violent mutant, and so forth. This idea that this technology is somehow alien to us. Now, the reason I think that happens in pop media is that the stories we tell ourselves in pop media are the way we process our fears and anxieties and the other great dramas in our lives. And so really what this is a portrayal of a change that is so profound that it scares us, right? It frightens us to our core, and so we portray it in this way. I don't actually think that's what's likely to happen, but many media journalists do. If you look at, even in the popular press, not the movies and so on, you see stories like this all the time. And so they're always framing the future transformation as somehow alien, in the sense that there's a before and an after. There's a magical moment, perhaps it's called the singularity, and after that everything's going to be different and really strange and really alien. Now, I think that's not a very useful idea, that framing of before and after. I think it's more likely that we're on a spectrum of change, that there's a gradual evolution. So what I'm going to try to do today is illustrate some of the invisible changes that are around us, pervading our environment. They're all around us. They surround us. They're so common. The touch points are so common, and we've heard about them piecemeal, different aspects of them, for so long and so many times that they become commonplace to us. We don't even see them. We're surrounded by tremendous change, but we don't even see it. So what I'm going to try to do this morning is tease out some of those invisible things that surround us. Now, I was inspired to do this talk by this quotation. Laplace was sort of France's version of Sir Isaac Newton, if you will. It's a little bit of a stretch, but he was an astronomer, he's a mathematician, and he made this observation, which really impressed me a lot as I was reading about it. He said the logarithm is an admirable artifice, which by reducing to a few days the labor of many months doubles the life of the astronomer. Now, later on today, you're going to hear from some brilliant scientists, including Aubrey de Grey, about technologies that will radically increase human lifespan. So that's one approach, right, to transhumanism, is to extend the human lifespan, the number of years that we're alive. But another approach, an alternative approach, is to find information tools, new media tools, that will allow us to get more done now, to make more out of the time that we actually have. And in fact, there's a tremendous proliferation of such technology available to us today. So these are tools that make it possible for us to do more with the time that we've got in our lifespan. In fact, the process of improving human lifespan, or improving, the improvements in human civilization, have always been governed, gated, by the access to the amount of information that's available. Let me talk to you a little bit about that. Here's 3 examples of technologies that have really significantly improved the lot of human beings on this planet. Electricity, the ability to fight disease with vaccination, and indoor plumbing. I know it's a bit mundane, but actually, arguably, it's one of the most significant technology advances to improve the lot of humans, sanitation. Now, each of these things took many centuries to evolve. So, electricity, obviously, the phenomenon of lightning was well understood, but it wasn't clear in the early days whether it was a chemical process or some other kind of process. And it really wasn't until hundreds of years after the first experimentation was done with electricity that they started to figure out the electromechanical and electromagnetic principles and the ability to generate and then plug that into transmission and then eventually the light bulb, which made it a useful innovation. So it was quite a long cycle, and what was holding that cycle up was access to the information on how to apply this. The same is true with vaccination. There were many misleading thoughts about what the source of human disease was. If you think about the Black Plague and that old nursery rhyme, ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. This poem, that little bit of doggerel, actually encodes some of the belief systems that people had in the medieval period that stay with us today. The idea of ring around a rosy is the breakout of the rose-colored breakout that you would get when you were infected with the plague. Pocket full of posy referred to flowers that people put around them because they actually believed at that time that odors, bad odors, are what caused the plague. So there was misinformation about the cause of the Black Plague. People would try to put flowers in their pockets so they'd have pleasant odors, and that was somehow going to ward off this disease. So people were aware of disease. They knew sometimes about the vectors of disease. Even when the microscope was invented, we could identify microorganisms, but again, there was a 200-year span before we were able to identify precisely which microorganisms. So the ideas were there. People were aware of the issue, but we lacked the information to actually do something about it. And the same is true of plumbing. The Romans had very effective sewage systems, but we couldn't really combat the odors of the sewers. So indoor plumbing wasn't really feasible until the late 1700s when they invented that U-shaped bend, first an S-shaped bend and then a U-shaped bend that trap that kept the odors out, and that enabled indoor plumbing and great sanitation gains. These are 3 technologies that, of course, today we assume, we take them for granted. They're everywhere we go. They're ubiquitous to us. But they took many centuries of effort in gathering more and more information to make them actually possible. I would argue that there's no shortage of resources in the world, but there is a shortage of information. The resources that are available to us are the resources that have always been here. In other words, what's available on the planet Earth for us to use as human beings to advance our lives and humanity and all living things. That's always been there. There's a finite amount of resource. But if you think about how our economics works, and the way we've been trained with modern economic theory, we always think about scarcity, scarcity of oil, scarcity of energy products in general, scarcity of water now, and so forth. So we're trained to think about scarce resources, but actually the resource that's scarce, most scarce and has most impact is information, access to information. When we find the information necessary, we can find a better use, a more efficient use of those resources, and then humanity takes a great leap forward. The example I would use is this. Today there's a tremendous amount of focus for all sorts of political reasons of global significance. We are concerned about access to energy. That's how our whole economy is driven, and of course rising economies like those in Asia require increasing amounts of energy to drive their economies forward. So human civilization, progress, and growth all depend on access to energy. And so today we think about scarcity. I assert that in 100 years we'll look back at this time and we'll chuckle to ourselves to think how inefficient we were with the resources that we had. That in fact, there's abundance around us. If you consider that all sources of energy are derived from the sun, all of them, whether they're hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, wind power, even nuclear power, are all driven by the processes of the sun, and we use less than 1% of 1% of the solar power that hits our planet. My belief is that through nanotechnology and other advances in material science, you're going to see tremendous gains in our ability to capture that wasted energy, use it more efficiently, and thereby drive the progress of civilization forward. We will look back at this time the way we look back today at the Victorian era, when they burned coal in the streets of London. The streets were full of smog at the time. You know, tons of black clouds hung over these cities. In a pall, when you took a train, you had to like dust yourself off because you were covered with ashes all the time. We look back at that time now, we think, well, they were so tremendously inefficient. It was such an unhealthy thing to do. I believe in the future, people will look back at this period and say, gosh, they fouled their environment. They poured these hydrocarbons out of the earth. They poured them into the oceans. They burned them. We have these little cars that we drive around that are burning, you know, ancient organisms, right? They're like, it's like a, well, anyway, I believe we're going to look back at this period and view it as tremendously inefficient. And in the future, we'll have found new ways with new information to actually get more out of the resources that are available to us. So information drives the advance of civilization. I'm going to present you with three arguments. The first is that information drives the advance of civilization. Media technology, the technologies are available to us to communicate that and share that information and act on that information. Well, those are actually what gate the progress of growth of information. And then finally, media technology ultimately shapes human civilization thereby. Those are bold claims. Let me proceed. I'll show you three giant leaps in history. The first giant leap in the history of humanity, of course, is the human's ability to use speech, articulate language, and communicate with each other. And so this is really the phase in prehistory. It's hard to say exactly when it occurred, whether it was 1 million years ago, 100,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago. Different anthropologists have different perspectives on that. But we know at some point humans developed the capacity to use speech to communicate language and communicate concepts with each other. And this enabled us to plan. It helped our brains, actually shaped our brains, because we were able to start to model scenarios, communicate them with other people, share ideas. Obviously, there were gains in our ability to survive, because we could organize to protect ourselves from threats. We could organize to find new sources of nutrition and food and so forth. So this is the first leap forward. Obviously, in prehistory, not something that we can point to as a specific moment in time. But speech is the first technology for information sharing that transformed human civilization. The second one was writing. And so about 5,000 years ago, the first big mega civilizations emerged, where man shifted from tribal kind of hunter-gatherer mode to agrarian societies that were quite big. These were made possible in part by the ability for people to record information and pass that down. Because one of the problems with speech, of course, is you can only communicate while you're alive, and when you're gone, it's gone for good. And people had very short lifespans in that early age. So by the age of 20, you'd be an old person. There's not a lot of time to communicate to the next generation if you're only 20 years old. When writing was possible, suddenly organizations, civilizations could organize themselves in much more complex ways. They could start to keep book records to track all the agricultural produce. They could start to design bigger cities and do architecture. And so you see, even today, the remains of these Sumerian cities in the region of Mesopotamia and Iraq. They're still with us today. These are the first big cultures that emerged. The next big leap of human civilization then, driven by an information technology, media technology. The next one, of course, the printing press, a topic I'm passionate about because it changed so much. The mechanization of the reproduction of information, changing it from a handmade process to something that could be done at scale, mass production, really introduced the modern era of civilization. So again, another media tool that made it possible now to take information and disseminate it much more broadly. I'll revisit this in a moment, but let me proceed, because I think we're on the brink of yet another similar transformation, perhaps the biggest of them all, because today we have more access to information technology and media technology than ever before. Think of it, just 15 years ago. My daughter Catherine's in the audience. When she was born 16 years ago, this is what your typical household had. You had an analog TV set, you had a landline telephone. It wasn't capable of much more than being a telephone. A VCR, you had a set-top box, perhaps if you subscribed to cable, but it was really a very simple set-top box that just decoded a cable system. It wasn't capable of much more. You might have had a game console, you might have had a film camera and a stereo, but these were fairly basic things, analog in the sense that they didn't really do anything other than the one use that they were intended for. Now let's fast forward to today. This is a typical household. I don't think this is an outrageous comparison. Look at this. Digital televisions, landline telephone, of course, we still have that. Now we've got this proliferation of gizmos that replace the analog VCR. Oh, thanks, that's fine. The set-top boxes now are much more capable, right? The game consoles are like microcomputers, and they're networked. So you've got these tremendous proliferation of services just in the game consoles, like the Xbox and the PlayStation and the Wii. Your mobile phone is a computer in your pocket that's connected to the web all the time. We also have an abundance of computing power in our houses, desktop computers, laptops, iPads, and so forth. Digital cameras. One of the things you'll see as a through line here is now all these devices can talk to each other. So you can create or capture information on one device, share it with another. Many of these devices are networked, and so increasingly we're able to spread that information around, share it. And some of them are things that we're able to take with us. They're portable. We're not bound to the house. But that's not all. These are also computing platforms, which means on top of all of this, you've got this tremendous proliferation of communication tools, and this doesn't even come close to covering the number of tools that we've innovated. Look at the proliferation, then, that we've had just in the span of 15 years. Now, certainly some of these things, like FTP, were available to people before 1995. I'm not trying to assert, but they were available in the limited context of the university, the Defense Department, certain corporations. They were not widespread. They certainly weren't widespread in households. Today, this stuff is commonplace. And if you look at the proliferation of social software now, and every week there are new breakthroughs happening there. It's just tremendous competition driving it. It's like an innovation factory. Open standards make it possible for anyone to innovate on top of this platform. You have a massive sharing of information going on. So the production of information is increasing faster than anything else in the world. Recently, Eric Schmidt made this comment at a conference, and the only person that picked it up was a journalist, a blogger from TechCrunch, and I was kind of astonished. Eric Schmidt said, every 2 days we create as much information as we did up till 2003 of all of recorded history. Every 2 days we're doubling that amount of information. And people sort of said, yeah, well, that's Google, right? I mean, you have to stop and think about that. That's an astonishing thing. Here's a graph that came from a recent article in The Economist. And you can see it's that classic Ray Kurzweil curve. We're hitting that knee in the curve that starts to take off, where the doubling and doubling and doubling means that massive amounts of information are being created. Here, they actually measured it. Now, this is a little bit I'm a little skeptical of this claim because the research was funded by the companies that make hard drives. But they estimate that we're going to create more than a zettabyte. Does anyone know what a zettabyte is? More than a zettabyte. A zettabyte is a 1 with 21 zeros after it. It's a big number. It's a big number. I'm told, and another way to look at it is it's 1.2 trillion gigabytes. So that's
0.1 moles.
Oh, great. Thanks. It's fabulous to talk to a bunch of geeks because there's always somebody who knows more than I do about this stuff, no doubt about it. One person said that if you put this information on a DVD, just the amount of information created in the year 2010, it would reach halfway to Mars. The stack of DVDs would reach halfway to Mars. I don't know if that's a verifiable claim. The point is that there's this tremendous surge of information. Let's take a look at some of the reasons why it's happening. Now, many people would say, well, yeah, sure, the computer is why this is happening, right? The introduction of the computer, it's kind of like the modern-day printing press. Well, yeah, but there's a really important but there. It's not just the computer. It's the combination of the computer with the telephone. Because that's where the communication happens, and that's where you get this logarithmic growth, because somebody sends something, somebody else comments, and they forward it to someone else, and so that's what's really generating this. It's not really the phone, of course. It's previously that cable, and increasingly it's on mobile devices like these that we carry around, so we're getting rid of the wire. But the point is, it's the combination of the network connectivity with the terminal, the computing terminal, that's making it possible for the proliferation of information to occur. And of course, it's not limited to devices like computers and phones and mobile phones, because now we have computers in our Adidas jogging shoes, and in our credit cards, and in our pens, and our passports. Believe it or not, your passport's communicating information about you all the time, transmitting information. They've now developed microprocessors that can be inserted in the human bloodstream. They even now, this is a recent article, it was on New Scientist, body organs can send status updates to your cell phone. They can tweet. It's astonishing. We're generating information in our sleep. This is a biofeedback thing that'll help you train yourself for lucid dreaming. So even while we're asleep, we're transmitting information. It checks out your brain waves and makes sure that you're getting it to the theta level of sleep wave or whatever that is. But it's a way for people to observe themselves when they're unconscious, to see that your brain is still transmitting information. It's not just that. It's also this room that we're in right now. It's very common now to walk into a room and see that everyone, like all of you, have computers or iPads or cell phones with them. And so even at an event like this, the audience is transmitting this information out to the web. Right now, people are tweeting and blogging and so forth. So this amount of information that I'm sharing with you is now being doubled and doubled and doubled just by the people in this room who are blogging it. Facebook user growth, it's been the big story. They made a movie out of it, of course, right? It's a giant story. Look at this growth curve. From 2004 to 2010, they broke the 500 million member mark. Now, Facebook isn't just about status updates. It's also the largest photo sharing site on the planet. Does anyone know how many photos are uploaded to Facebook each month? Anyone want to take a stab? Okay. 2.5 billion photos are uploaded to Facebook each month. They will exceed 30 billion photos uploaded this year. Next year, if the trend holds, and it probably will exceed 40 billion photo uploads. That is an astonishing number, folks, for a website that didn't even exist 7 years ago. The advent of cheap cameras is another factor driving this. And the idea that all the devices we buy now have eyes in them. So everything is starting to extend. Every gizmo we carry around with us has an eye built into it. These cameras, these flip cameras, cost $125. Any kid can go make a movie. When I grew up, access to movie gear was kind of a dream that you yearned for because you had to go rent the gear and you had to get the film and get it developed and processed. There were just all these costs involved. Today, parents can use a camera like this as a stocking stuffer for their kids. So a whole generation of kids are growing up who are media savvy, and when they communicate, they're not going to do it with email. They're not going to do it with Microsoft Word. They're going to be doing it with multimedia. Media savvy generation. Check this out. This is hours of video uploaded to YouTube per minute. Every minute of every day, on average, 35 hours of video is uploaded to YouTube. 35 hours per minute. Now, a year ago, I noticed that YouTube, there was a stat that was revealed about YouTube that said, if you considered all the video that was broadcast on the major 3 networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC here in the United States, if you took those 3 networks since the advent of television, call it 1945, till today, so about 65 years of broadcasting, if those 3 networks broadcast 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, if you took all those hours of video, last year, YouTube gained that much video, new video, every 2 months, that same amount. This year, that amount of video is uploaded every month. That amount of video is uploaded every month. The same amount as if every major broadcast network was broadcasting original content 24 hours a day since inception of television. We gather that much information every month. So these are staggering numbers. It's extremely hard to get your head wrapped around a number like 1 billion. It's very hard to visualize. So I'm trying to use these examples. But we're not limited to Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. I mean, these are obvious examples. Frankly, it's abundant. I mean, there's thousands of social sites out there, and they're all seeing the same logarithmic growth curve of usage. This is a very common phenomenon when you go to Twitter these days, because they've grown from 30 million people last year to 130 million people this year. It's just amazing. And it's not just people tweeting and people posting and blogging and sharing videos, but even major universities and other institutions are now starting to say, let's put all of our information on the web and make it available to everyone. There's really great hope that all the knowledge of humanity is going to be available to anyone who seeks it in the not-too-distant future. We're not quite there yet, but that's clearly the direction we're trending. And organizations that have information that's not in digital form are starting to digitize because this has become cheaper and cheaper. So you're seeing art museums and libraries take their old text and put it. So that also adds to this great volume of information that's out there. And some organizations, new companies like Demand Media, are creating these vast farms of bloggers who are writing content for fairly cheap wages, below minimum wage. So they're creating kind of spam farms that are generating even more content, even more information for the web. It's not just writing. It's not just people producing. It's also the human genome is generating tremendous amounts of information that we're just beginning to explore and understand. In particle physics, things like the Large Hadron Collider generate massive amounts of information. I don't know if you noticed this recently, but they just upped the amount of protons that they're, the amount of collisions that they're doing inside of the Large Hadron Collider, and that actually generates more information. So it's just generating tremendous amounts of data. Does anyone know how you measure data in this device? Are you familiar with the term? Come on. Terabytes. No, not terabytes. Barns. I don't know why, but the physicists use the term barns to measure data.
A cross-section, a nuclear cross-section. You can't hit the broadside of a barn with the joke.
Oh, okay. Really? Oh, that's really fun. Okay. So they measure information units in barns in the Large Hadron Collider. Here's their growth. Look, it's the exact same chart, guys. this is when they were doing pico barns. And then they said, all right, you know what, let's crank it up. Let's crank up the number of particles in this thing. And now we're doing inverse, oh my gosh, what is that? I don't even, it's this massive amount of data is being generated. Forgive me, it's a lot, right? It's a lot. Houses are being fitted with smart meters for energy usage. There are actually 75 million of these smart meters now deployed in the world, and in the next 4 years, that number will triple. So there'll be more than 200 million smart meters. So it's not just about people expressing themselves, connecting with each other in social media, and taking our libraries of information and moving them online. Those things are all true. That is all happening. But now also the world is starting to be wired up. So people like David Orban at WideTag are starting to develop these intelligent sensor systems. So those smart meters are connected to what's coming soon, smart houses. So that smart meter can run all the systems in your house and track it and really turn your house into a giant computer or information processing device. Those are, of course, connected to smart grids. So we're now starting to see neighborhoods and cities. There are 65 smart grid projects happening right now in the world. This is not science fiction. This is happening right now. And of course, our cars are increasingly getting more and more smart. Someone told me there's more computing power on most automobiles than there was on the Apollo space program in the space capsules. So our cars are becoming these mobile computing platforms, and increasingly they're transmitting telemetry as well that's gathered. Even our infrastructure, like bridges, are being wired with sensors as well, and our water systems and so forth, for more efficient usage, to monitor the health of the infrastructure and so forth. And again, it's not science fiction, folks. This is taking place right now. The world is starting to get wired up to transmit information. This is when they talk about the Internet of Things. This is what we're referring to. These sensors are placed in the ocean to measure seismic conditions and to measure, to do undersea exploration for energy and for currents and so forth. And so there's also this transformation there where our natural world is starting to be wired up. What's occurring on a global basis is that everything is going to be transmitting data. These are RFID tags, radio frequency tags. They now are being produced on these little sticky sheets. It used to be fairly expensive. It was like a miniature chip. They were too expensive to use. Walmart's wanted this for years to do inventory management, so they've been leaning on the industry to develop these tags. Now you can buy them and peel them off like a sticker and stick them on any product. It's astonishing. So you're going to start to see every product, every consumer product, all that stuff that's produced by Procter & Gamble and Lever Brothers in your Walmart store is going to be an intelligent device that's going to say, hi, I'm a tube of toothpaste. I've been on the shelf this long. My price point is this amount. I've recently been discounted this amount. It's going to change the way we manage inventory. It's going to change the way we use resources. It's going to change the transportation of these products around the world. It's also going to change the way we shop, because you're going to have smart carts that help you find deals and so forth. So it's going to change a lot of our civilization. Even livestock is getting these RFID tags. So these are Wi-Fi tags or RFID tags that have been stuck in the ear of a cow. Each cow generates 200 megabytes of data a year. I don't know what information they're getting from the cows. All I'm telling you, folks, is that every device in the world is starting to generate information around us. You may have noticed a proliferation of security cameras after 9/11. And certainly if you've been in New York, you've noticed this. In the city of London, about 10 years ago, I was talking to some engineers from Philips, and they told me with great pride that they had installed a network of 30,000 cameras in London. And this is around 2000. This is before 9/11. And I thought, 30,000 cameras, that seems like an awful lot. Who needs 30,000 cameras? Today, there are more than 500,000 security cameras in the city of London. 500,000. Most city blocks in central London have about 25 to 30 security cameras on them. There's an article that came out recently in the block around George Orwell's house, where George Orwell used to live in London. There are 25 security cameras just in a one-block radius around his house. So smile, folks, because generally speaking, you're on a camera if you're in a city. And with image processing technology, we're now able to do scene detection, scene analysis, gait analysis, facial recognition. So you're transmitting information just by walking through a city. That information is now being recorded and increasingly digitized and increasingly analyzed by software systems. So you'll actually be able to trace someone's movements through a city. I'm not sure. This gives me the creeps. I'm not so certain how I feel about this. There's a lot of concern, maybe some ethical issues that may emerge from this. Now in the sky, we're starting to use, obviously, satellite technology for imaging we've been using for decades. But we're also using these blimps and these predator drones and so forth to gather important information. And again, this is not science fiction. This stuff is happening live today as we speak You can even buy your own miniature hovercraft for $300 for Christmas for that guy in your life who really wants to set up his own Predator drone and fly over to the neighbors and hook a camera to it. These things are Wi-Fi enabled, they have cameras on them, and so they transmit data. The point I'm trying to make is that we're starting to wire the whole world, not just us. Of course, we're familiar with that, right? We carry these little digital gizmos with us. We transmit information. We're kind of common. I mean, that's kind of commonplace to us. That's not such an unusual idea to us, that we're constantly updating our status and tweeting, Facebooking. So we got into that habit pretty quickly. We got in that habit, if you use a BlackBerry, you've been hooked on that thing, connectivity. We've been hooked to that idea for quite a while. So these are habits that we take them for granted. They're almost invisible to us, right? You don't even think about it. You only think about your BlackBerry or your iPhone when you leave it at home, and all of a sudden you feel naked, you feel disconnected, and it's a freaky feeling. But what's increasingly happening is that we're now also connecting the world around us, in a way that it can talk back to us. And so in the middle, there's all kinds of gear, infrastructure, interfaces, and so forth. But what's happening is our senses are being extended on a planetary level, all around us. And soon you'll have access to it. This is the very beginning, so it's a little clunky. I know that sounds like a crazy claim, but very quickly, if you look at the advances that I just showed you over the last 15 years, and then project forward 15 more, you don't have to wait for the singularity to imagine a time when human beings will have superhuman awareness and access to tremendous amounts of information that previous generations simply did not have. Now let's backwind to the last time this happened. Backwind to the mid-1400s when Johannes Gutenberg introduced the printing press, an invention of tremendous significance. I would love to go into detail. I'm crazy about this because it's actually shaped our modern world in so many ways. And so what I want to do is just take 1 second to think, what were all the changes that followed? Well, there were big consequences. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's death, in 1517, Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. And this began the schism that broke the church's monopoly on information, a monopoly that really had blocked the progress of information, blocked the growth of information for hundreds of years. And of course, shortly after Martin Luther, you had the Protestant movement broke and splintered again and again and again. So you started to have a division, and as a result, a much greater increase in the amount of information because people began to debate with each other. And the idea of comparing ideas or contrasting or debating or maybe conflicting, in some cases killing people over ideas, occurred, and wars did occur. About 100 years after that idea, where there could be different points of view about your relationship to God, your relationship to faith, about 100 years later, René Descartes perfected the scientific method, the mathematician, and he also contributed to the description of the world in numbers. This concept that Pythagoras introduced, that you could describe the world numerically. And that's an incredibly important thing for the advance of science, because when you can describe the world in numbers, you can have a rational discussion about it. And the scientific method is what enables us to do that. It enables one person to come up with an idea, prove it, and allow other people to test that idea themselves, replicate that. And of course, the printing press made it possible for the transmission of this information. So you saw a tremendous surge in the amount of information that was available. Just in the 15 years after Gutenberg's death, in the last quarter of the 15th century, 15 million books were produced, which doesn't sound like a big number compared to the 40 billion photos on Facebook, but at the time, you have to imagine, a library of 40 books was considered a giant library. So the concept of 15 million was a huge number in the 1500s. And then, of course, the advances in science and man's newfound understanding, maybe a newly defined relationship to the natural world, caused John Locke and other philosophers of the Enlightenment to begin to consider the rights of man and the principles of modern philosophy that gave birth to modern democracies, beginning with the United States and then the revolution in France, and there followed 50 years later by a series of cataclysmic revolts and revolutions in Europe that caused that old medieval order to be thrown off, and modern democracies, parliamentary democracies, start to emerge. And so really the printing press was the genesis, the idea that you could mechanically reproduce information, get it out to thousands of people. At the time, that was a big deal. Now we can get it out to millions of people. But at that time, that was a really big idea. The proliferation of information, the easy access to information, the idea that you could debate information, argue it, prove your point scientifically, defend your point scientifically, and enable other people to build on that information. This is the basis for modern civilization. This is the basis for the world that we live in today, the scientific society that we live in today. So these are all the big consequences of the printing press. But folks, all of these things are changing. We live in a world that is so bound up in print consciousness because it's how we define ourselves. It's how we share important information. It's how we write down our laws and the rules that govern civil society. It's how we transmit scientific information. It's how we express our creative ideas. Everything that we wish to share is bound up in print consciousness. And I would argue that most electronic media of the 20th century are derivatives of print in the sense that the business models and the rules that govern them are very much a print-oriented way of thinking. Publishing in general hasn't really changed a huge amount in the last 400 years. But now it's all changing. And so we're going to experience some tremendous shock ourselves. We're going to experience something that is akin to an identity crisis ourselves as we go into this new connected world. It's not just about the fear of privacy or, the big brother is watching me or something. What's really going to occur is that the way we've been trained to think from our youth, because the way we're trained to think as children was from a book in a classroom, a book that was made possible by the printing press. The way we've been trained as humans to manage information has been defined by the book for the last 500 years. Going forward in the future, the way we deal with information will be defined by a two-way network, and that changes everything. Let's look at some of the vectors of change. The first one is your role as a participant in this universe. In a print media world, in a world, the Gutenberg world, if you will, your role is you're a passive observer. You buy the book, you're a consumer. You sit there and read the thing, you're an observer. You watch a TV show, you're an observer. That's shifting now to where people are becoming active participants in a media experience that they actually can make a difference in. They can participate in a meaningful way. It influences or changes the outcome that other people are going to experience. That's a gigantic shift. So, normally at this part of a talk, I would talk about interactive media, games and so forth, the things that I've done in my life. But today what I want to talk about is the news. Because, of course, the printing press created the news. Prior to the printing press, there was no obligation to share information with the masses of humanity. Prior to the printing press, the decisions were made in a closed room, either by the nobility or by the clergy. And it wasn't like they felt obligated to go out and tell the people what was happening. But the printing press made it possible for people to actually understand what was occurring. And in some of the political wars that occurred in the 1600s and thereafter, different political interests found it of value to start to promote their point of view and start to persuade the emerging middle class, the mercantile class, and so forth. And so the printing press became a very useful way to get that information out there. And that, as a result, changed the way we think about people. It really changed the role of society because it created this public space where ideas now were presented for consumption, not just for consumption, but for persuasion. So shortly after the printing press was introduced, members of the royalty, the noble class, started to produce propaganda, and not just small amounts of propaganda, but by the score, thousands of pieces of propaganda that extolled their virtues and talked about the divine rights of the kings and how they were inspired, and basically justifying why they were in charge and everybody else was a peasant labor, so was serving them. Whether or not that was successful, the point is that the use of print technology to persuade people was one of the first artifacts of the introduction of the news and the creation of a public sphere and the idea of a public. Of course, then party politics emerged, and fairly soon. So you saw interests. Before we had an electoral system, there were still groups around the absolute rulers. In the period, say Louis XIV, there were groups, different interests, and they would publish broadsides that gradually emerged into newspapers, but also into posters that were put up in the streets to persuade people to one view or to the other. So there was this notion then that emerged as an artifact of the printing press that there was an obligation to communicate to the masses of people. There's an obligation to tell them what was going on, to keep them informed, and that their opinion mattered. Well, that was a really big deal. Now, let's fast forward to today, to 2009, just to last year, in Iran, where street demonstrations occurred, and they occurred because there was a dispute about an election, the presidential election. Now, the autocratic government there, the theocratic government in Iran, shut down all the mainstream media. They shut down the radio. They shut down television. They kicked the BBC out of the country. They took away the equipment that the CNN reporters had. So news media were shut down. And this is a way to repress the amount of information that was going to people. And so people used tools that are readily available. Twitter emerged as an organizational tool here. There's some debate about whether or not that really was influential or not, but that was a milestone. It was very interesting to me because I was watching that Twitter feed the whole time. It was quite an interesting way to know what was going on in a part of the world that was basically blacked out. Well, just a year ago, that was last May. Now, we're having this season of protest around the world. I don't know if you've noticed, but if you read the press, in every corner of the world, populations are coming forth and they're protesting austerity cuts, they're protesting religious issues, they're protesting political issues and so forth. And they're all using social media. So recently in Seoul, Korea, at the G20, they organized themselves using social media tools. Recently in the UK, after the election there, people stormed the Conservative Party, took over the building, and they actually used Twitter and other social media tools to organize themselves. So instead of being programmed by someone who's trying to persuade you to your point of view, people are now starting to use social media tools to self-organize. It's like collective intelligence. That's a moving thing. Everyone can participate. There's no longer this idea that there's an audience that's passive and a producer of content. We're all participants. Another major shift, another vector change is the value. Where's the value created here? The book is the first bound media product. So they created a market for information for the very first time. I'm going to have to move a little faster here because I'm being told we're having time pressure here. I'll move a little faster. So the book is the first packaged media good. And all subsequent media sort of followed that model of publishing. But now we're starting to see in the two-way network, fixed media doesn't work so well. And we're shifting towards the service-based economy. These are some examples in the media business, but there are others in other fields. But increasingly, data itself is going to become where the value is. Google teamed up with the CIA to create this thing called Recorded Future that takes sentiment analysis of what's happening in the social sphere and just analyzes huge amounts of data that people are generating and starts to convert it into a useful product, which is market intelligence. It can be useful for marketing. It can be useful for companies that want to trade stock or analyze the stock market and so forth. Recorded Future. Recently, sentiment analysis was done on Twitter by some academic researchers. And they said, gee, if we can just get sentiment analysis which is either favorable or unfavorable, you know, how much fear is out there, how much anxiety are people experiencing, maybe we can correlate that with the stock market. They found that they actually could do, they had 87% accuracy in predicting which way the stock market would go based on social graph analysis. And a company that I'm involved with in the UK, Visual DNA, is now making this available to anybody who needs it. Publishers, advertisers, even consumers are going to have access to their own Visual DNA to see the behaviors that you have on the web, how you're using the web casts off a kind of data smog. You know, there's a little trail of data that you leave when you use these networked information sites. And now that information can be repackaged, reused in meaningful ways where value can be created. Now recently this happened. There's a website, online game called Entropia. And there's a digital club that a guy bought for $100,000, real money. He mortgaged his house to buy a club called Never Die. And he built it up and got a huge audience. This is a virtual world, folks. He sold it for $600,000 last week. So there's real value being built in these virtual worlds. And the projection is that the US sales of digital objects will exceed $2 billion. So real value is there. $2 billion in a multi-trillion-dollar economy, not significant. But the trend line is of interest, right? You're starting to see value is migrating from fixed, bound physical products into data that resides in a digital network. The format is evolving from fixed to fluid. Fixed media, you're familiar with that. This does not work in a two-way network. It gets file shared and ripped off. So the value is destroyed in a two-way network. But if you consider something like Wikipedia and the zillion other social sites that are out there, this is just the most obvious example. These are dynamic knowledge bases where all the participants can contribute, well, you know, under certain restrictions, but anyone really who's committed to contributing in a productive way is able to contribute. And there are thousands and thousands of examples of these. So these are dynamic sites. They're not fixed. They're not bound. They don't have a long development cycle, a long production cycle. They're almost instantaneous. They can be updated in real time. And so they live and grow and breathe, which means the production of information is increasing, but also the accuracy of that information can increase. One of the big problems in the print-bound world is that content is stuck in physical form and it can't be revised. And so mistakes can live for a very long time. In a two-way network, mistakes are corrected almost instantaneously. And it's not just sites like Wikipedia, the other social media sites, the Web 2.0 sites. You're starting to see human-machine interfaces like this new device, Kinect, which is part of the Xbox service from Microsoft. Kinect allows you to have a much more conversational interface with a machine. It's actually a transformative technology. I can get rhapsodic about this because I think this is an amazing new thing. I'm going to push on past it. Metadata, which used to be invisible, actually throwaway data that surrounded our content, now is becoming not just visible, but tangible in the real world. So the printing press didn't just introduce books. It also introduced many other types of media, including bound atlases and maps. And that really was a huge milestone. It was a huge milestone. It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence that the great age of exploration occurred at the same time as the printing press, because the ability for people to get access to these maps was critical for navigation purposes. And of course, that information improved slowly over time. It was very inaccurate. This is a map that was roughly contemporaneous with Gutenberg from the late 1400s, 1470. So as you can see, it's actually fairly accurate for the 15th century, but nevertheless, you know, there's some obvious things that are quite wrong about it. Well, today,
actually, so one of the impacts of this, though, is that it started to create two ideas, two worlds, a bifurcated existence. There was the real world that people lived in. That was the town you're in, the people you knew, the stuff that was around you. And then there was a sort of information world that existed bound up in print. And the information world looked like this, and then the real world looked like this. But the two were split. And today, we live in this bifurcated mode. It's ingrained in our consciousness. It's ingrained in our consciousness, right? You go out in the real world, you do your stuff, and then you come back to your computer. You come back to your desktop, and then you process information. Well, watch what's happening now. With things like Layer and the other augmented reality software services that are available on mobile phones, combined with GPS and location technology and, of course, wireless networking, it means now that we can bring this information with us and apply these layers and really start to reveal an invisible layer of data that's always been there, but it wasn't accessible to us. And my talk is about making more information accessible to people. That's where progress comes from. So you're starting to see projections that in the future we'll have pop-up displays like this, heads-up displays on our cars that tell us about the hidden metadata that surrounds every object that's transmitting information. And already today, there are real applications for this. You may have heard about Google's robot cars. Just the last month, Google announced that they had just quietly been testing robot-driven cars, and they had driven 140,000 miles with robot cars in the United States, which is a little bit alarming because you kind of wonder who is the driver that has liability for those cars. But it turns out, if you do a search, you'll see some extraordinary videos of robotic automobiles that are driven by robotics. And of course, they're guided. These navigation systems are taking advantage of that very same information I just showed you. So it's not just useful information for us as we go through town when we're looking for something, when we want to know about the history of a place, or we're looking for a restaurant recommendation and so forth. It's also helping us drive these automated systems. So this is from the Freie Universität in Berlin. And you can, you can use your iPad to call this robot taxi. Now, you'll see there's drivers in this. But there's a video on the web that'll show you this is a robot-driven cab that can come pick you up, and it will take you wherever you want. You command it with an iPad, and there's no driver inside of it. So it's using telemetry, and it's using all this data to drive people around. So I'm going to have to wind up. I'm very sorry, but there's more. Just last week, I met Pranav Mistry, who's a researcher at MIT. And he's creating these brilliant new interfaces that actually eliminate the computer. And they allow you to use any surface on the Earth as a computing platform. Here, for instance, is how he dials his phone. He's a little projector, and so he can project onto any surface. And then the camera tracks his motion, and it's able to use that as a computing platform. So he's erasing this thing that was in between us and the information world, which was the computer and the network, and he's making it possible for us to turn any flat surface into a computing surface. I'll skip and wind up, OK? I understand. So just to summarize, hang on.